The night air over Sable Mesa was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and failure. Cassia Roebuck stood with her arms crossed, a futile gesture against a chill that came from within. Before her, motionless as the rock formations that clawed at the starry sky, was the man they called Greyhawk. The name was a settler's invention, a label for something they could not comprehend. His true name, he kept for himself, locked away like a sacred thing. Behind her, the landscape told the story of their ruin. A field of barley, once their pride, lay scorched and brittle, its golden heads blackened by a relentless sun. Beyond that, where the black willow wash should have been a silver ribbon in the moonlight, there was only a chasm of cracked, thirsty earth. The water was gone, choked off upstream by a crude dam, a monument to the greed of the Colorado and Salt River line. The silence between them was a heavy blanket, disturbed only moments before by her father's voice. Ebenezer Roebuck, a man weathered and bent by the land he loved, had delivered his verdict with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You'll marry him, Cassia. It's the only way to protect this land." The words still hung in the air, a command that felt like a betrayal. She looked at Greyhawk, the Apache who was both her savior and, now, the symbol of her cage. Gratitude and rebellion churned within her like a storm. His face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and hardship, was unreadable in the pale light. He simply watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing, offering neither comfort nor pressure. He was a force of nature, much like the drought that was killing them, but one that had, for reasons of his own, chosen their side. 3 days ago, that force had been unleashed. The so-called company men had arrived, 6 of them, riding with the swagger of men who believed their authority was absolute. They wore tarnished tin stars, proclaiming them deputies of the county, a flimsy lie meant to give their theft the color of law. Their real master was the railroad, and their mission was to secure the community well for the construction camps, draining the last dregs of life from Sable Mesa. Cassia had been in the barn, mending a harness. When she heard the confrontation, her father, armed with a rusted shotgun and righteous fury, was no match for them. They had laughed, swatting his weapon aside as if it were a child's toy. Then Greyhawk had appeared. He moved not like a man walking, but like a shadow detaching itself from the noonday heat. He had been tracking a mountain lion on the ridge and had seen the dust from the riders. He carried no rifle, only a long knife at his hip and the unnerving stillness of a predator. He didn't shout or make threats. He simply stood between the thugs and the well, his presence a challenge more potent than any weapon. The leader, a burly man with a sweat-stained hat, had postured and blustered, spitting tobacco juice near Greyhawk's feet. "This is railroad business. Injun, move along before you get hurt." Greyhawk had not moved. He had spoken, his voice low and calm, yet it carried across the yard with chilling clarity. "This water belongs to the land. You belong to no land. You will leave." The fight, when it came, was not a fight at all. It was a lesson in brutal efficiency. The first man who lunged found himself on the ground, his wrist bent at an impossible angle, a gasp of pain his only war cry. The second swung a pickaxe handle, a clumsy arc that met only empty air as Greyhawk sidestepped, the motion fluid and economical. A precise strike to the man's throat sent him choking to his knees. The others hesitated, their bravado evaporating under the Apache's cold, focused gaze. He disarmed them not with speed, but with an unnerving understanding of balance and weakness. In less than a minute, 6 armed men were humbled, their false stars glinting in the dust at their feet. Greyhawk had pointed the way they had come. "Go, tell your chief the well is guarded." They went, dragging their injured, their retreat a cloud of shame-faced dust. The story had traveled faster than a horse could gallop. By nightfall, all of Parish Bend was buzzing with it. An Apache living in the Roebuck's barn, defending a white man's land. It was unnatural, a disruption to the fragile order of things. Tongues wagged in the saloon and over picket fences. The whispers grew ugly, twisted by fear and prejudice. Some said Greyhawk had put a spell on the Roebucks. Others, their voices lowered with a perverse mix of dread and excitement, claimed that Cassia had been chosen, that the Apache had claimed her as part of his spoils for protecting the farm. The rumor clung to her like burrs, making her feel watched, branded. Now, under the cold gaze of the moon, her father's decree threatened to make the vilest rumors true. This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, a deed signing her over in exchange for a warrior's protection. Later, when her father had retreated into the dark farmhouse, a silhouette of defeated pride, Cassia found Greyhawk by the horse corral. The familiar scent of hay and leather did little to soothe her frayed nerves. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone the only sound. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "He means it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father, he'll try to force this." Greyhawk paused, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. A man afraid of losing his shadow will bargain with the sun. His words, cryptic and wise, cut through her anger, leaving a raw ache of understanding. Her father was desperate. They all were, but desperation was a poor foundation for a life. She took a breath, the dry air burning her lungs. An idea, wild and dangerous, had taken root in the fertile soil of her despair. "Then we use it," she hissed, stepping closer, into the circle of his stillness. "We use his desperation. We use their fear." She looked toward the dark shape of the mountains, where the railroad was slowly strangling them. If a marriage is the excuse they need to believe this land is protected, if it's the only language the law will listen to, then we give them that excuse. She turned back to him, her eyes pleading in the dim light. "Let them think we are bound. If marriage is a tool to get our water back, then we'll use that tool against them." Greyhawk finally set the knife and stone aside. He rose to his full height, and for the first time, she felt the intimidating force of his presence directed fully at her. He was not a tall man, but he was built of the desert itself, lean, hard, and unyielding. He studied her face, his gaze stripping away her bravado, seeing the frightened woman beneath the defiant strategist. His reply was blunt, devoid of any sentiment. "I will not take a wife who is bartered like cattle." The words were a flat rejection, and her heart sank. But then he continued, his voice a low rumble, "But I will stand with you to overturn this table." He gestured vaguely toward the darkness that held the town, the railroad, and the whole broken system. It wasn't a promise of victory, but it was a promise of allegiance, a promise to be a partner, not a master. And in the desolate quiet of Sable Mesa, that was the only promise that mattered. This was the 4th year of the thirst. The sun rose each morning not as a promise of life, but as a brassy, unforgiving eye in a bleached white sky. The Black Willow Wash, once a lifeline that bisected the valley, had surrendered. It was now a graveyard for river stones, its bed a mosaic of deep, sun-baked cracks wide enough to swallow a man's boot. The land was dying, and its people were dying with it. A slow, parched decline measured in withered crops and hollow-eyed cattle. The source of this creeping death was an ugly scar of raw timber and packed earth thrown across Whispering Draw, a few miles upstream. This makeshift dam was the handiwork of the Colorado and Salt River line, a monument to progress that was strangling the life out of Sable Mesa. Water that should have fed the wash was being diverted, funneled through a hastily dug canal to quench the thirst of steam engines and the sprawling construction camps. The railroad's legal claim was a flimsy piece of paper, stamped with the county seal but riddled with ambiguous language. It spoke of temporary usage rights for industrial development, a phrase that meant nothing and everything, a legal fog designed to obscure outright theft. The architect of this slow strangulation was a man named Gideon Pike. As the railroad's foreman, Pike was a master of the double-edged promise. He had ridden into Parish Bend not as a conqueror, but as a savior, speaking of jobs, commerce, and a future linked by iron rails to the prosperous East. He offered wages to desperate ranchers and work to idle farmhands. And in return, he asked only for their silence. He bought their complicity with the coin of hope, ensuring that when they saw the water level drop, they would see the gleam of a silver dollar instead of the specter of their own ruin. To enforce this fragile peace, Pike relied on the authority of Sheriff Orlo Finch. Finch was a man whose ambition had long ago outgrown his integrity. His badge, once a symbol of justice, was now merely a token of his allegiance to the railroad. The deputies he dispatched to carry out Pike's will were not sworn officers of the law. They were hard men hired from dusty saloons and border towns. Their loyalty bought with whiskey and cash. Their tin stars were props, meant to intimidate farmers into believing their dispossession was legally sanctioned. They were the muscle behind Pike's veneer of legitimacy, ensuring that any dissent was crushed before it could grow into a rebellion. It was this brutal reality that had driven Ebenezer Roebuck to his desperate gambit. The old man was trapped. He owed money to the mercantile for seed that had withered in the ground, and the county tax collector was threatening foreclosure. He saw Pike's dam not just as a thief of water, but as the final nail in his coffin. In Greyhawk, he saw a power that Pike and his hired guns could not understand. His proposal of marriage was born of a frontier mind, a place where pacts were sealed not with ink, but with life and honor. He clung to a half-remembered, romanticized notion of blood covenants, believing that by binding his daughter to the Apache warrior, he was forging an unbreakable alliance, an ancient treaty of protection that the railroad's lawyers could never unravel. It was a desperate, flawed, and profoundly selfish plan, the last act of a man watching his world turn to dust. Greyhawk, however, operated on a plane of knowledge far older than county lines or railroad charters. His connection was not to the settlers' towns, but to the land itself. He was known to the Gray Crane Band, a reclusive Apache group who resided in the formidable Cinder Basin and who held the memory of the land in their stories and traditions. From them, he had learned the desert's secrets. He knew that beneath the parched surface of Sable Mesa, a hidden river flowed an ancient aquifer the Apache called the Rolling Shadow. This subterranean current was the true lifeblood of the valley, a secret known only to the creatures of the wild and the few who knew how to listen to the earth. There was, once, a map, a topographical survey drawn decades ago by a U.S. Army captain named Horst, a man with a rare curiosity for the land's deeper mysteries. The map had reputedly marked the location of the aquifer, a faint blue line charting the course of the hidden water. But the map had vanished, lost to the archives or a dusty back room, becoming the stuff of local legend. Gideon Pike knew the legend, too. He was hunting for that map with a quiet intensity, for it would give him the ultimate prize, the legal justification to sink deep wells and claim the Rolling Shadow for the railroad, completing his conquest of the valley's water once and for all. The key to their survival lay not in legend, but in a small, forgotten chest in the corner of Cassia's bedroom. It had belonged to her mother, a woman who had loved the wild beauty of Sable Mesa and had taken the time to learn some of its language, while searching for old family papers. Cassia's fingers brushed against a small, tightly rolled piece of deerskin tucked inside a worn Bible. She unrolled it carefully. It was not a formal map, but a simple, hand-drawn sketch of the local landmarks. Near a crude drawing of the Twin Rocks at Mesquite Ford, her mother had inked a single, elegant symbol, a crescent moon lying on its back. It meant nothing to Cassia, yet she felt a flicker of significance, a sense that this was a message left for her to find. She brought the deerskin to Greyhawk that evening as he sat by the corral, braiding a leather rope. He looked at the sketch, his expression unchanging, but she saw a new light in his dark eyes. He traced the crescent symbol with a calloused finger. "This is an old sign," he said, his voice low. "My grandmother's people used it." He looked from the map to the distant silhouette of the Stagbone Ridge. "It marks a place of deep water, water that flows toward the Singing Stone." And in that moment, the entire shape of their problem shifted. The path forward was no longer a grim march to a sacrificial altar, but a race to uncover a hidden truth. The desperation that had choked Cassia began to recede, replaced by the sharp, clear focus of a plan. It was her plan, forged from his knowledge and her resolve. "Not a marriage," she said, the words coming in a rush as the idea took shape. "A contract, a legal fiction." She knelt in the dust before him, her eyes bright with a sudden, fierce intelligence. "We go to the courthouse. We file a petition for a marriage contract, a nominal one. That makes us a household in the eyes of the law, and, as a household, we file an immediate injunction to protect our primary water source from industrial encroachment until a proper survey can be done." It was a brilliant gambit, using the settler's own legal system against itself. A formal petition would force the hand of a judge, compelling the court to recognize their claim and, most importantly, to halt Pike's draining of the river while the claim was investigated. It would buy them time to find the proof that Greyhawk already knew existed. Greyhawk listened, his head tilted slightly. He saw the fire in her, the quick mind that had seized upon his knowledge and weaponized it. He saw a partner, not a pawn, but his world was governed by honor, and he would not be part of a deception that trapped her. "This plan requires your voice," he stated, making it a condition, not a question. "Your full agreement, and the paper must say what is true, that this bond is for the purpose of the water, and it does not tie you when that purpose is done." This was his term, his own line drawn in the sand. He would fight with her, but he would not own her. Freedom was the principle for the water, and for her. The final piece was her father. Cassia and Greyhawk presented the plan to Ebenezer in the dim light of the farmhouse kitchen. The old man was skeptical, his mind still clinging to the primitive certainty of a blood pact. He struggled with the legal complexities, the idea of using the law as a shield rather than a sword. But as Cassia explained it, laying out the steps with a clarity that belied her youth, he began to see the cold, hard logic of it. He saw a path that did not require him to sell his daughter's future. He looked from Cassia's determined face to Greyhawk's steady gaze. He saw not a savage and a sacrifice, but a unified front, an alliance of wisdom and will. His pride was a stubborn old mule, but his love for his land was stronger. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all 4 years of drought, he picked up a pen. He signed his name to the bottom of the agreement Cassia had drafted, his hand trembling slightly. As long as the crop had a chance to survive, he would consent. He would accept this strange, modern bargain and pray it was enough. The air inside the Parish Bend County Courthouse was stale with the smell of old paper and settled dust. It was a place built on the rigid lines of Eastern law, a world away from the fluid, unwritten rules of the Mesa. Cassia Roebuck felt the disconnect in her very bones. She stood beside Greyhawk, whose stillness seemed to absorb the room's anxious energy, making the scuffed floorboards and peeling varnish look fragile and temporary. Between them stood Amos Bell, a young lawyer whose face was still more accustomed to books than to the hard-bitten realities of frontier justice. He held their petition in his hands as if it were a holy text. They were a spectacle. The clerk stared, his pen hovering over his ledger. A few loafers in the back of the room whispered behind their hands, a woman in a calico dress with a rancher's son in tow, an Apache warrior who looked as if he had been carved from the red rock of the canyons. It was a picture that defied all logic in this small, stratified town. Their audience was Judge Temper Clay. He was a man whose age was written in the deep lines around his eyes, but whose gaze was as sharp and clear as a winter morning. He read their petition without expression, his long, bony fingers tracing the carefully worded clauses. Amos had called it a probationary marriage contract, a legal instrument so obscure he'd had to dig it out of a territorial law book from a decade prior. Appended to it was their true objective, an emergency petition to preserve the status quo of the water rights of a newly forming household. "A 90-day contract," Judge Clay murmured, his voice a dry rustle. He looked over his spectacles, first at Cassia, then at Greyhawk. "An unusual arrangement." "These are unusual times, Your Honor," Cassia replied, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "Our land is dying. We ask only for a reprieve until a proper survey can determine the facts of the water flow." Gideon Pike and Sheriff Finch had been summoned, and they stood near the judge's bench radiating contempt. Pike, dressed in a city suit that looked out of place and tight across his broad shoulders, gave a short, derisive laugh. "This is a farce, Judge," Pike said, his voice slick with manufactured reason. "A desperate ploy by a failing farmer. The railroad has a duly executed permit for temporary water access. This union is a sham to obstruct progress." Sheriff Finch nodded in agreement, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "It's a woman's trick, temper, a scheme cooked up with an engine to tie up the courts." Judge Clay ignored them. His eyes remained on Greyhawk, who had not spoken a word. "And you?" the judge asked directly. "You consent to this contract?" Greyhawk met the judge's gaze. "I stand with the woman. I stand with the land," he said. The simple words, delivered in his low, even tone, carried more weight than all of Pike's blustering. The judge was silent for a long moment. He tapped the petition with his finger, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "The law is designed to protect property and homesteads," he declared, his voice rising with authority. "A household, whether probationary or permanent, is entitled to that protection." He picked up his gavel. "A temporary injunction is granted. The Colorado and Salt River line will immediately cease the diversion of water from the Black Willow Wash. A territorial surveyor will be dispatched to assess the watershed. This order stands until that survey is complete and reviewed by this court." He brought the gavel down. The sound was like a crack of thunder in the small room. Pike's face turned a mottled red. Finch sputtered, but the judge's glare silenced him. The fight was over. For now. They had won the first round. News of the injunction spread through Parish Bend like a grass fire. The town buzzed with gossip and speculation. That night, Cassia found 2 full cans of fresh well water sitting on her porch. There was no note. The next morning, another appeared. It was a silent rebellion, a quiet vote of support from other ranchers who were too afraid to challenge Pike openly, but who understood the language of thirst. The victory, however, made her father more anxious. The legal paper felt less real to him than the threat of Pike's retribution. "What if you change your mind?" Ebenezer asked her one evening, his hands twisting a piece of rope. "If you withdraw from this agreement, Clay will lift the order. We'll be worse off than before." "I won't withdraw," Cassia said, looking him straight in the eye. "Not as long as I'm the one making the choice." Her voice held a new steel, forged in the courthouse and tempered by the small victories of the past few days. That week, Greyhawk began to teach her. He took her to Stagbone Ridge as dusk settled, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. "The rock holds the memory of water," he told her, his voice a low murmur against the whisper of the wind. "You must learn to listen." He led her into a narrow, slit canyon, the walls rising so high on either side that the sky was just a dark blue ribbon above them. He lit a torch, the sudden flare of light casting their shadows, long and distorted, against the ancient stone. He showed her how to find the smoothest, most solid faces of the rock, places where the earth's pulse was strongest. "The Apache say the deep water sings," he explained, holding the torch high. "It is not a sound for the ears, but for the bone." He guided her to a concave wall of granite that shimmered in the torchlight. "Here," he said. "Listen here." Cassia hesitated, then pressed her ear against the cool, unyielding stone. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the world and focus on the silence. There was nothing but the thrum of her own blood. Greyhawk stood beside her, holding the torch perfectly still, his presence a silent, patient anchor. The flame threw a warm, flickering light on her face, and for a moment, his expression softened. He saw not a partner in a legal scheme, but a woman of incredible courage. pressing her ear to the heart of the world, hoping to hear a secret. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second over the flame, a silent acknowledgement of the strange and dangerous path they walked together. A bond was forming, not of law or necessity, but of shared risk and growing trust. Then she felt it, a vibration, so faint it was barely perceptible. It was a low, deep hum, a thrumming that seemed to resonate in her teeth and the bones of her skull. It was the singing he had spoken of, the hidden river, the rolling shadow, was real. She pulled back from the rock, her face alight with discovery. "I heard it," she breathed. Their search for proof was cut short by an act of open aggression. Amos Bell had pitched a small tent on the Roebuck property, using it as a base to draw up new survey maps based on Greyhawk's guidance. One night, a flicker of light from the direction of the tent woke Cassia. A figure was darting away into the darkness, and the canvas wall of Amos's tent was beginning to glow. Before she could even shout, Greyhawk was moving. He burst from the barn, a blur of motion in the moonlight. He didn't waste time with water. He grabbed a heavy horse blanket, beat the flames into submission, and plunged into the smoking tent. He emerged a moment later, coughing, with Amos's leather satchel in his hand. The maps inside were singed at the edges but miraculously intact. The attack proved two things: their plan was working, and their enemy was getting desperate. "They're trying to frighten us," Cassia said the next day, her jaw set. "We need to show them we can't be frightened. We need to push back, make this public." She looked at Greyhawk. "The Willowcut market is this Saturday. Everyone will be there. We need to make a public declaration of our engagement." Greyhawk considered this. A public display was not his way, but he understood the strategy. "This is your choice," he said. "The ritual will be of your choosing." On Saturday, the market at Willowcut was a swirling hub of commerce and gossip. Farmers sold their meager produce, trappers displayed their pelts, and families mingled, exchanging news. Cassia and Greyhawk walked directly into the center of it all. A hush fell over the crowd as they passed. Cassia stopped by the auctioneer's block. She did not produce a ring. Instead, she held up a beautiful, yet simple, blue bloom scarf, woven with the delicate blue flowers that bloomed for a fleeting week each spring. It had been her mother's. She handed it to Greyhawk. Her voice, clear and strong, carried over the silent crowd. "This was my mother's. It represents the strength and life of the women of this land." Greyhawk took the scarf. He did not tie it around his neck or wrist. Instead, he drew his long hunting knife. The crowd gasped. With slow, deliberate movements, he wrapped the soft blue fabric around the worn leather handle of the knife, knotting it securely at the base of the blade. He held it up for all to see, the symbol of her heritage joined to the symbol of his power and protection. "I will hold this in trust," he said, his voice resonating with an oath-like quality. "And I will keep the distance you desire." It was a message to her as much as to the crowd, a public reaffirmation of their true agreement. Just then, two of Pike's known roughnecks began circulating through the crowd, handing out crudely printed flyers. The sheets were filled with vile accusations, calling Cassia a turncoat and Greyhawk a savage, claiming their union was a blasphemy intended to ruin the town. It was a clumsy, brutal attempt to shame them. But Amos Bell was there, and he calmly walked behind the men, collecting every discarded flyer he could find. "Evidence of slander and intimidation," he murmured to Cassia with a thin smile. "Thank you, Mr. Pike." The spectacle was cut short by the arrival of a rider from Parish Bend. He handed a sealed envelope to Amos, who opened it and read it aloud. "By order of Judge Temper Clay," he announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "The official territorial survey of the Sable Mesa watershed is hereby scheduled. It will commence in 7 days. Any party found interfering with the surveyor or the proceedings will be held in contempt of court and subject to immediate arrest." A line had been drawn. The countdown had begun. The 7 days granted by Judge Clay were a sliver of time, a closing window against the vast, patient expanse of the drought. There was no time to waste on legal maneuvering in town. The proof they needed was not in books, but buried in the bones of the earth. Greyhawk led the way, not on the worn cattle trails, but into the labyrinthine depths of Copper Lantern Gulch. The place was aptly named. The late afternoon sun struck the high canyon walls and reflected downward, bathing the narrow floor in a warm, coppery glow that felt both beautiful and oppressive. He moved with an economy of motion that Cassia found mesmerizing. He was not following a path so much as reading a story written in a language she was only just beginning to comprehend. "The animals know," he said, his voice low, not wanting to disturb the profound silence of the gulch. "When the surface water is gone, they follow the memory of it. This is the trail of the thirsty beast." It wasn't a trail in the human sense. There were no boot prints, no cleared brush. It was the lowest possible line through the landscape, a subtle depression in the terrain, a natural channel where gravity would pull any hint of moisture. Greyhawk paused, pointing not to anything obvious, but to the shaded, northern face of a large boulder. "Look." Cassia knelt, her eyes scanning the rock. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed it a delicate, silvery green moss, clinging to life in the perpetual shadow. It was barely alive, crisp to the touch, but it was there. "It's dry," she said, confused. "It waits," Greyhawk corrected gently. "It only grows where there is deep dampness in the stone. It drinks the breath of the water below." A few yards further, he stopped again, crouching over an anthill built into a fissure in the ground. The ants were a busy, dark river of life. They dig deep. Their tunnels reach the cool earth. When they carry their eggs out, they bring the moisture with them. He touched a finger to the soil near the entrance to the nest. It came away slightly darker than the surrounding dust. It was almost nothing, but it was everything. Cassia took out her notebook and a piece of charcoal, meticulously sketching the location of the boulder and the anthill. She was the translator, the chronicler who would turn this ancient, living knowledge into the cold, hard facts that a man like Judge Clay would understand. Their first real test came in a small basin where the gulch widened slightly. Greyhawk searched the sparse vegetation until he found what he was looking for, a young, supple willow, one of the few trees tenacious enough to survive in this arid landscape. He cut a forked branch with his knife, trimming it until it was perfectly balanced. He held the two forks in his hands, palms up, the single stem pointing forward. He called it the dragonfly, for the way it hovered and trembled, sensing things unseen. He walked slowly, his feet shuffling through the dust, his entire being focused on the tip of the willow branch. Cassia and Amos, who had joined them with his surveyor's tools, watched in breathless silence. For a long while, nothing happened. The branch remained still, an extension of Greyhawk's own patient stillness. Then it quivered, a tiny, almost imperceptible vibration. It dipped once, sharply, as if bowing to the ground. "Here," Greyhawk said. Using a hand auger from Amos's pack, they began to drill into the hard-packed earth. For the first foot, the soil was bone-dry, as fine as flour. But then, the resistance lessened. The soil coming up in the auger's spiral was darker, cooler. A faint, metallic smell rose from the hole, the scent of iron and deep earth dampness. Cassia knelt and touched it, a profound sense of discovery washing over her. It was real. The water was here. She opened her new map, a copy she was making for Amos, and next to the location they had just marked, she drew the elegant, reclining crescent moon from her mother's deerskin scroll. It was a link across time, a daughter confirming a mother's secret. As twilight bled into the sky, they were not alone. A pack of coyotes, their forms like gray ghosts in the fading light, appeared on the ridge above them. Their hungry, intelligent eyes watched, and a single, exploratory howl echoed through the gulch, a lonely, haunting sound. Amos instinctively reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Greyhawk held up a hand. "They are not hunting us. They are curious, and they are thirsty." He moved not toward a weapon, but toward a patch of gray-green sagebrush. He gathered a large bundle, and with a flint and steel, he lit the end, blowing on it until it produced a thick, pungent smoke. He walked in a slow circle around their small camp, letting the aromatic smoke drift on the evening air. The coyotes, agitated by the scent they deeply disliked, whined and backed away, melting back into the shadows. It was a lesson in power. True mastery of the wild was not about the force you could project, but the knowledge you possessed. While Amos checked their position with his compass, Cassia studied the map, connecting the dots of their discoveries. A sudden, stunning realization struck her. "Greyhawk," she said, her voice filled with a new urgency. "Look, all the signs, the moss, the damp soil, the way the branch pulled, they're all on a line. And that line, it runs southeast." He came and looked over her shoulder. She was right. The hidden river was not flowing directly down the valley toward the Black Willow Wash, as everyone had always assumed. It was cutting diagonally across the landscape, toward the formidable rock formation known as the Singing Stone. "Pike's Dam," Cassia breathed, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "It's in the wrong place. He's not just damming the wash. The wash must be a secondary branch, an overflow. By choking it off, he's starving the main aquifer that feeds our land from below. He's not just stealing the water we can see. He's killing the water we can't." The discovery re-energized them. The next day, they reached the base of the Singing Stone, a massive granite monolith that rose from the desert floor like a cathedral. An opening at its base led into a shallow cave, its entrance smoothed by centuries of wind and water. This was the place Greyhawk had been leading them to, the place her mother's map had hinted at. Inside, the air was cool and still. Greyhawk gestured for silence. He pointed to the back wall of the cave, and Cassia understood. She stepped forward and, just as he had taught her in the narrow canyon, she pressed her ear to the stone. This time there was no strain. No doubt, the sound was immediate and undeniable. It was a deep, resonant hum, a powerful vibration that felt less like a sound and more like a living presence within the rock. It was the collective voice of countless gallons of water, flowing deep beneath them, its power resonating through the solid granite. It sang, a powerful, ceaseless song of life. It sounded, she thought, like a giant bronze bowl being struck by a soft mallet, a pure, unending tone. She pulled away, her eyes wide with awe, and looked at Greyhawk. For the first time, she saw the ghost of a true smile touch his lips. It transformed his stoic face, lighting it from within. "The water sings for you, Cassia," he said softly. They spent the rest of the day working as a seamless unit. Greyhawk identified the strongest points of resonance, and they drove wooden stakes into the ground to mark the aquifer's path. Amos, his scientific mind now fully convinced, worked tirelessly with his surveyor's level, taking readings and making calculations, verifying the subtle downward gradient of the land that confirmed the water's southeastern flow. He was charting the song, translating its music into the rigid language of angles and elevations. The three of them, the keeper of ancient knowledge, the determined woman of the land, and the man of law and science, had become a formidable team. That night, they made camp at Mesquite Ford, beneath the twin rocks her mother had drawn. The air was cold, and a billion stars glittered in the ink-black sky. Greyhawk gave Cassia his thick wool cloak without a word. She wrapped herself in its warmth, the faint scent of sage and wood smoke clinging to the fabric, and lay down near the fire. She felt an overwhelming sense of trust, a feeling so foreign and yet so welcome that it brought tears to her eyes. She fell asleep almost instantly, secure in the knowledge that he was watching over them. Greyhawk took the first watch, sitting with his back against a rock, the firelight flickering on his impassive face. He looked at the sleeping form of the woman who had upended his solitary existence. He had agreed to this pact to protect a piece of land, to honor a debt. But somewhere along the path of thirsty beasts, his purpose had shifted. He was no longer just protecting the land. He was protecting her. He felt his heart, a thing he had long guarded, lean in her direction, drawn by her courage and fire. The proof they had sought with instruments and instinct was delivered to them at sunrise by nature itself. Cassia awoke to a soft bleating sound. On the rocky slopes above their camp, a small herd of bighorn sheep had descended. They were not drinking from the stagnant pools in the nearly dry creek bed. Instead, they were gathered around a dark patch of rock near the base of the cliff, licking the stones with their rough tongues. They were drinking the dew, the moisture that seeped overnight from the porous rock, fed by the immense, unseen river beneath. It was the final, irrefutable witness. As they prepared to leave, a sense of quiet triumph in the air. Cassia walked to a patch of desert marigolds growing in a sliver of shade. Their bright yellow flowers were a defiant splash of color against the muted tones of the desert. She picked a single, perfect bloom. She walked over to where Greyhawk was packing his saddlebags. His knife, with her mother's blue bloom scarf tied around the handle, was resting on his bedroll. Wordlessly, she took the marigold and carefully tucked its stem into the knot of the blue scarf. The vibrant yellow against the soft blue was a small, beautiful testament to their partnership. It was a gesture of reciprocity, adding a piece of the wild, living land to the symbol of their pact. He saw the movement, looked down at the flower, and then up at her. He gave a single, slow nod, his eyes conveying an understanding that needed no words. Their moment of peace was shattered when Amos rode back from a quick trip to a nearby rancher's outpost where he had arranged to meet a messenger. His face was grim. "It's from one of Leora Penn's contacts in town," he said, holding out a crumpled note. "Pike knows we're out here. He knows we're getting close. A wagon, heavily loaded and covered with a tarp, left his main camp an hour before dawn. My source is certain. It's carrying blasting powder." Cassia looked toward the distant shape of the singing stone. Pike wasn't going to fight them in court with maps and lawyers. He was going to erase the evidence. He was going to silence the song in the stone forever. The willow-cut market pulsed with a nervous, vibrant energy. It was the one day of the week the scattered, isolated lives of the valley converged, creating a temporary town of canvas stalls, livestock pens, and dusty wagons. The air was thick with the smells of horse sweat, frying bacon, and the sharp tang of patent medicines. Against this backdrop of desperate commerce and strained community, Cassia and Greyhawk appeared. They walked from the dusty road into the throng, and a ripple of silence followed them. It was not just their unlikely pairing that drew every eye, but the way they were joined. His hand held hers, not in the possessive grip of a husband or the flirtatious clasp of a suitor, but as a simple, solid fact. It was a public declaration of a compact, a visible symbol of their united front. There was no pretense of starry-eyed romance. Their expressions were serious, their steps measured. This was not a courtship. It was a campaign. Their destination was a small, raised platform in front of the town's only saloon. A sturdy establishment run by Leora Penn. Leora was a woman who had seen more of life than most men in the valley and had carved out her own territory with a sharp mind and a sawed-off shotgun kept under the bar. She met them with a nod, her eyes conveying a silent, powerful endorsement. She had quietly offered them the platform, a small stage from which to make their case not to a judge, but to the jury of their neighbors. Cassia stepped onto the platform, Greyhawk taking a position just behind her and to the side, a silent, watchful guardian. She waited for the murmuring crowd to settle, her gaze sweeping over the faces, some curious, some hostile, some openly supportive. "Most of you know me," she began, her voice carrying with a surprising clarity. "You know my father. You know our farm on Sable Mesa, and you know our thirst." She let that last word hang in the air, a shared experience that bound them all. For weeks, we've watched the black willow wash dry up. We've been told it's because of the drought. We've been told it's a necessary sacrifice for the progress the railroad promises. She paused, letting them absorb the familiar narrative. "That is not the whole truth," she continued, her tone shifting from communal grievance to scientific revelation. "For the past week, with the court's permission, we have been surveying the land. We weren't looking at the river you can see, but the one you can't. There is a deep aquifer, an underground river that flows beneath our feet. My mother knew of it. The Apache have always known of it. It flows southeast, toward the Singing Stone. The wash is only a small branch of this deeper, more powerful source." She spoke in plain, simple terms, describing how the weight of the water made the granite vibrate, how the deep moisture sustained plants that should have withered and died. She wasn't speaking of magic or superstition. She was describing a natural system, a hidden world of cause and effect. The crowd was captivated. This was not the hysterical pleading of a desperate woman. It was a lesson, a revelation. She was giving them not just a complaint, but an explanation. The lesson was interrupted by the furious arrival of Gideon Pike. He shoved his way through the crowd, his face a thundercloud of rage, with Sheriff Finch trailing in his wake like a nervous shadow. "Lies," Pike roared, pointing a trembling finger at Cassia. "A fantastical story cooked up to stop honest work. This is a fraudulent engagement, a conspiracy to defraud the railroad and this entire community of its future." Cassia did not flinch. She looked down at the enraged foreman, and a small, calm smile touched her lips. It was a smile of such profound certainty that it seemed to infuriate Pike even more. "I have no doubt our engagement is a surprise to you, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice cool and steady. "But it is not fraudulent. I chose him." She glanced back at Greyhawk, a look of unshakable solidarity passing between them. Then she turned her gaze back to Pike, her smile hardening into a blade. "And the court will choose the truth." "That's enough," Sheriff Finch bellowed, stepping forward and puffing out his chest. He pointed at Amos Bell, who was standing at the edge of the platform taking notes. "You, Bell, you're under arrest for inciting a public disturbance." Before Finch could take a step, a piercing sound cut through the air, the sharp, commanding blast of a brass whistle. Every eye turned to Leora Penn, who stood in the doorway of her saloon. The whistle still at her lips. It was a signal. At once, a dozen gruff, formidable-looking merchants and teamsters who had been leaning against the saloon walls straightened up. They began to move, not aggressively, but deliberately, forming a solid, silent wall between the sheriff and the platform. The community, which Pike had tried to own and Finch had tried to intimidate, was pushing back. Their collective gaze, cold and unwavering, was fixed on the sheriff. Finch faltered, his blustering authority withering under the weight of their silent judgment. Greyhawk seized the moment. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Pike. His voice, though quiet, cut through the tension. "You call our words lies," he said. "Then see the truth for yourself. When the territorial surveyor arrives, send one of your own men with him, a man you trust. Let him walk where we have walked. Let him put his ear to the stone. Let him see the evidence with his own eyes." It was a brilliant, unassailable challenge. To refuse would be an admission of fear, a tacit acknowledgement that he knew what they would find. Pike was trapped, his face contorted, but he managed to force a condescending smile. "Fine," he sneered, making a show of magnanimity. "I'll send a man to document this ridiculous charade." He turned, and as he shouldered his way back through the crowd, he leaned close to one of his most ruthless enforcers, a man with cold, empty eyes named Mac Doolin. "The cave at the Singing Stone," Pike whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "Make sure the surveyor finds nothing but rubble." As the confrontation dissolved, Cassia saw her father standing near a wagon. Ebenezer looked old and frail, but for the first time in months, he was standing straight. As she watched, another old farmer, a man who had lost half his herd to the drought, caught Ebenezer's eye and gave him a short, sharp nod of respect. Another followed suit. Her father was no longer just the desperate old man willing to trade his daughter. He was the father of the woman who was fighting for them all. A flicker of pride, long extinguished, rekindled in his eyes. Just then, two young boys, their faces smudged with dirt and newsprint, darted through the dispersing crowd. They were the sons of the town printer, energetic and entirely innocent of the adult drama swirling around them. "Extra, extra," they shouted, their voices high and clear. "Marriage for water. Judge Clay seals the deal, read all about it." They ran through the market, cheerful and unharmed, their calls serving as the final verdict on the day's events. The story was no longer a scandalous rumor. It was a public cause. The ride home was slow. A brief, unseasonable shower had passed through while they were in town. Not enough to help the land, but just enough to turn the dusty roads into a slick, muddy morass. The wagon wheels sank deep, and their single horse struggled. "It will be faster if we ride," Greyhawk said, swinging up onto his Appaloosa. He looked down at Cassia, a question in his eyes. Without hesitation, she gathered her skirts and allowed him to pull her up to sit behind him. It was a necessary act, but it was also profoundly intimate. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance. She could feel the solid strength of his back against her chest, the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of his shirt. With every step the horse took, she was aware of the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat. The wind whipped strands of her hair across his shoulder, and she breathed in the clean, wild scent of him: sage, leather, and the desert dust itself. She rested her head against his back, closing her eyes, feeling a sense of safety and rightness that defied all logic. That night, they sat by a small fire outside the barn. The air was cool and clean after the rain. They didn't speak for a long time, simply watching the flames dance and listening to the crickets. The tension of the day, the fear, and the small triumphs had created a new space between them, a space filled with an unspoken understanding. He turned to look at her, his face softened by the firelight. She met his gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not the stoic warrior, but the man who had held the torch for her in the dark, who had trusted her with his people's secrets, who had stood as her unwavering shield. Slowly, he leaned in. It was not a sudden, passionate impulse, but a deliberate, gentle movement, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned forward to meet him, a quiet acceptance, a voluntary step into this new, uncharted territory. Their first kiss was long and soft, a discovery rather than a conquest. It was a question and an answer, a silent conversation that spoke of gratitude, of trust, and of a deep, burgeoning affection that had grown, against all odds, in the harshest of soils, when they finally drew apart. It was only by a few inches. He rested his forehead against hers, and they stayed that way for a long moment, simply breathing together, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her in a firm, protective embrace, in that circle of warmth, beneath a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. Cassia felt that for the first time since the drought began. She was no longer fighting alone. The wind that scoured the high desert that night was a restless thing, carrying whispers and lies. It was a perfect cover for a man like Mac Doolin. He moved with a quiet, practiced menace, leading a mule laden with 2 heavy wooden crates. The animal's hooves, shod in iron, made a faint, unnatural clinking sound against the stone, a sound that did not belong in the domain of the soft-footed creatures of the night. His destination was a shadow among shadows, the entrance to the Singing Stone Cave, miles away, camped in a sheltered spot on the valley floor. Greyhawk's head came up. He had been in a state of light sleep, a warrior's repose. his senses still sifting the night air. It wasn't a loud sound that woke him, but a wrong one. He had spent a lifetime learning the rhythms of the desert night, the sigh of the wind through sage, the distant cry of a hunting owl, the rustle of a pack rat. The metallic chime of shod hooves on the high trail to the singing stone was a discordant note in that ancient symphony. He was on his feet in an instant, the transition from sleep to full alertness seamless. His hand went to the knife at his belt, the one that still wore Cassia's scarf. On the crest of Stagbone Ridge, a lonely silhouette against the stars. Cassia saw it too. Not a man, but a tiny, moving light, the faint glow of Doolin's shielded lantern as he navigated a treacherous turn. It was the signal she and Greyhawk had agreed upon. If any light appeared on that trail after midnight, the threat was real. She pulled a small, silver-backed hand mirror from her satchel, a piece of vanity from her past. Now a tool of war. Angling it carefully, she caught the faint light of the rising half-moon and flashed it 3 times toward a predetermined spot near the cave's entrance. It was a silent, desperate message. He is here. Near the base of the singing stone, hidden in a crevice. Amos Bell saw the flashes. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was a man of books and legal briefs, not of midnight ambushes. But resolve hardened his features. He pulled a small, sharp scalpel from his medical kit, a tool for careful incisions, not for violence. He began to creep, silent as a shadow, toward the path leading to the cave mouth. Greyhawk moved with the speed and silence of a striking hawk. He took the high ground, flowing over the rock and brush, his moccasins making no sound. He arrived on a ledge directly above the cave entrance just as Doolin was unstrapping the first crate. He could smell the acrid scent of blasting powder and the slow-burning punk of a fuse. Below, he saw Amos's shadow detach itself from the rocks. Doolin worked quickly, placing sticks of dynamite and a coil of fuse wire into a deep fissure in the rock. As he turned to get the detonator caps, Amos lunged. He didn't attack the man. He attacked the plan. The scalpel flashed, slicing cleanly through the fuse wire near the dynamite sticks. Doolin spun around with a guttural roar, the element of surprise lost. He saw Amos scrambling back into the rocks and drew a heavy pistol. Before he could aim, a shape dropped from the ledge above him. Greyhawk landed with a soft thud, his body absorbing the impact. He drove his shoulder hard into Doolin's side, sending the larger man crashing against the rock face. The pistol flew from Doolin's grasp, skittering into the darkness. What followed was not a duel. It was a desperate, grunting struggle for survival. Doolin was bigger and heavier, a brawler fueled by brute force. Greyhawk was faster, using Doolin's own momentum against him, a master of leverage and balance. They grappled, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their bodies straining. They crashed through the brush, tumbling over rocks, getting closer and closer to the sheer drop at the edge of the trail. They locked together, a knot of struggling limbs, and rolled to the very precipice. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the brink, the vast, empty blackness of the canyon below them. Greyhawk, on the bottom, felt the loose scree give way beneath him. With a final, explosive effort, he twisted his body, using his legs to shove Doolin's weight away. Doolin, his balance lost, cried out as he went over the edge. There was no long, sickening fall. His cry was cut short by the sound of tearing canvas and snapping branches. He had fallen directly into the center of a massive, ancient thicket of catclaw acacia that grew from a ledge 20 feet below. The vicious, hooked thorns broke his fall but exacted a terrible price. He was alive, but entangled and bleeding, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. Greyhawk and Amos soon had him tied up, his pained groans a confession of his own. As they secured their prisoner, the air changed, the wind died, and a strange, heavy stillness fell over the land. The temperature dropped, and the sky, which had been clear moments before, was now being devoured by a bank of roiling, bruised-looking clouds that had swept in from the west with uncanny speed. A flicker of distant lightning illuminated their monstrous shapes, followed by a low, menacing rumble of thunder. Then, a single, brilliant fork of lightning struck the twin rocks at Mesquite Ford, miles away but visible as day. The crack of thunder was instantaneous and deafening. The storm was upon them. The first drops of rain were huge and cold, splattering in the dust like coins. Within minutes, it was a downpour, a torrential, unseasonable flood unleashed from the heavens. The dry, cracked earth could not absorb the deluge. Water began to pour down the canyons and arroyos, turning them into churning, muddy torrents. A cry from Amos alerted them to a new disaster. The dry wash where he had set up his main survey camp was now a raging river. The flash flood was tearing at his tent, threatening to sweep away all the maps, records, and instruments, the sum of all their work. "The stakes!" Cassia shouted over the roar of the storm, having run down from her post on the ridge. She untied their horse, her mind working with frantic clarity. She looped a rope around the main tent poles and tied the other end to the saddle horn, using the horse's strength to pull the heavy canvas and its precious contents to higher ground, just as the main force of the flood hit. The torrent of muddy water surged past, carrying rocks and debris. Amos, trying to save a dropped case of instruments, slipped on the slick mud and was swept into the current. The water was only waist deep, but the force of it was immense, pulling him under. Greyhawk didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope Cassia had just untied from the tent, looped one end around a sturdy rock outcropping, and threw the other end out toward the struggling lawyer. "Amos, grab it!" he yelled. Amos's hand caught the rope, and Greyhawk dug in his heels, his muscles straining as he pulled the younger man from the grip of the treacherous, muddy water. Soaked, shivering, but safe, they watched the awesome power of the storm. And then they saw it, as the sheer volume of water scoured the landscape. It tore away a section of loose rock and soil on the slope just below the singing stone. There was a deep, gurgling sound, and then, with a great surge, a new spring burst forth from the mountainside. It wasn't a trickle, it was a powerful jet of clear, clean water, gushing from the earth like a whale spouting at sea. It was the rolling shadow, the hidden river, forced to the surface by the immense pressure of the storm. It was their proof, delivered by the hand of nature itself, a witness that could not be perjured or destroyed. Miles away, at the railroad camp, Gideon Pike was in his own panic. The storm was threatening to wash out a key section of track where a train loaded with expensive milled lumber was scheduled to pass. In a desperate, short-sighted gamble to relieve the pressure on the trestle bridge, he ordered his men to open the sluice gates on his makeshift dam. He hoped to drain the backed-up water into the Black Willow Wash. He had miscalculated the physics of his own creation. The sudden release of water created a powerful backwash, a wave that surged in the wrong direction. It slammed into the weakest section of the poorly constructed dam. With a great groaning of timber, the dam cracked, then burst. A tidal wave of mud, rock, and water cascaded not down the wash, but sideways, directly into the railroad's main supply depot, burying tents, tools, and a month's worth of provisions under a sea of sludge. The news of the flood reached Parish Bend by morning, twisted and malicious. Sheriff Finch, desperate to deflect blame from Pike's incompetence, began spreading the word. It was the Apache, he claimed. His strange rituals had summoned the unnatural storm, causing the flood to destroy railroad property. It was an old, ugly lie, playing on the deepest fears of the townsfolk. But Leora Penn had already made her move. Using the confession they had gotten from a whimpering Mac Doolin, she had her printer work through the night, as Finch was spinning his tales of dark magic. Leora's boys were distributing a new flyer. It contained Doolin's sworn statement, in his own words, detailing Pike's plot to dynamite the cave. It was a counter-narrative of truth, a shield against Finch's poison. In the dead of the storm-racked night, Ebenezer Roebuck made the ride of his life. He wasn't the fearful, defeated man he had once been. He sat tall in the saddle, leading a second horse on which the bound and miserable Doolin was slumped. He rode directly to Judge Clay's house, hammering on the door until the old judge himself opened it. In the flickering lamplight, Ebenezer Roebuck, his face streaked with rain and resolve, presented the judge with the saboteur and his confession. High above the chaos, Cassia and Greyhawk had taken refuge in the one place they knew was safe and dry, the Singing Stone Cave. The new spring gushed nearby, its song now audible to the ear, a joyful, splashing sound that promised life. They built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the cave, its warmth a welcome comfort against their soaked clothes and the chill of the night. They sat close together, shoulders touching, watching the flames. The roar of the storm outside was muted, a distant rumble in the warm, quiet dark. All the pretense, all the strategy, fell away. There was only the truth of what they had endured together. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The simple touch was more profound than any kiss. "In the morning," she whispered, her voice husky, "when the storm is over." "Yes," he replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "We will speak of what is in our hearts. No more agreements. Only the truth." He pulled his wool cloak around both of them, creating a small, warm world of their own. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against the top of her head. They huddled together for warmth, a silent testament to the bond forged in conflict and sealed by the storm. In the flickering firelight, he began to whisper, not of feelings, but of names. Apache names for springs born from storms, names that meant sudden heart or sky's gift. She whispered back names from her own stories, names like Hope's Run and Mercy Creek. They were not just naming a spring, they were christening their future. And as the storm raged outside, inside the ancient Singing Stone, they found a quiet, profound peace, finally and completely safe with each other. The morning after the storm, the world was washed clean. The air, scrubbed of dust, was so clear the distant mesas seemed close enough to touch. Judge Temper Clay did not summon them to the stuffy confines of the Parish Bend courthouse. Instead, he brought the court to the land, his buggy, followed by a procession of wagons and riders from town, made its way to the foot of the Singing Stone. They convened in the open air, a makeshift courtroom where the jury box was a line of sun-warmed boulders, and the only gavel was the sound of the new spring, gushing clear and cold from the mountainside. The evidence, the judge had declared, would speak for itself. Pike and Sheriff Finch stood apart, a sour island of resentment in the assembled crowd. Mac Doolin, his arm bound in a crude sling and his face a mask of sullen pain, was positioned between two of Leora Penn's sturdiest bartenders, ensuring he didn't wander. Amos Bell, his usual nervousness replaced by a hard-won confidence, was the first to present their case. He unrolled his freshly drawn maps on a portable trestle table, the pages weighted down with stones against the morning breeze. He spoke with the precision of a scholar, pointing to his measurements of the land's gradient, showing the undeniable downward slope from the aquifer's source toward the Roebuck farm. He produced soil samples in glass jars, the dry, lifeless dust from the surface, and the dark, rich, damp earth taken from the test holes. He presented his calculations, a litany of numbers and angles that proved, with the cold logic of mathematics, that the primary watercourse did not follow the Black Willow Wash. "The science is irrefutable, Your Honor," he concluded. "The dam erected by the Colorado and Salt River line is not merely diverting a stream, it is severing the very artery of this valley." Then, Cassia stepped forward. She carried no maps, no jars of soil. Her evidence was the story of the land itself. "Mr. Bell has shown you the what?" she began, her voice clear and strong, reaching every member of the crowd. "I am here to tell you the how." She described the folk methods Greyhawk had taught her, how to find the silver moss that grew only in the breath of deep water, how the ants brought moisture to the surface, how a simple willow branch could tremble and bow when it passed over a hidden current. She held up the deerskin map her mother had drawn. "This is not a surveyor's chart, but it is a map of memory. A map of knowledge passed down. Science and memory, Your Honor, are telling the same story." She connected the logical points of Amos's presentation with a narrative of wisdom and heritage, blending the two into a single, seamless truth. The crowd listened, rapt. It was a language they all understood. Judge Clay nodded, his eyes thoughtful. He turned his gaze upon Mac Doolin. "Mr. Doolin, you were found here, injured, in the middle of the night. You have given a statement. I want you to repeat it now, for this court." Doolin shifted, his eyes darting toward Pike. Pike gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, a silent threat. But the steady gaze of the judge, and the memory of his terrifying fall, were more immediate. "He hired me," Doolin mumbled, his voice raspy. "Mr. Pike, he paid me $200 to close the cave. Said it was a hazard. He gave me the powder himself." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Sheriff Finch went pale, his hand twitching near his pistol, but he did nothing. Pike's face was a mask of fury. "A desperate lie from a common criminal trying to save his own skin," he roared. "I have proof of my claim, the real proof." He strode forward and dramatically unfurled a large, rolled document on Amos's table. The official United States Army survey map, drawn by Captain Horst himself in '68, as you can see. It clearly shows no significant water source in this location. It designates this entire area as arid and unsuitable for irrigation. The map was impressive, yellowed with age and covered in official-looking script and symbols. A wave of uncertainty went through the onlookers. It looked authentic. Judge Clay himself leaned forward to inspect it, a frown creasing his brow. Greyhawk, who had remained silent and motionless until now, stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply pointed one long finger at the compass rose drawn in the corner of the map. "Captain Horst was trained at West Point," Greyhawk said, his voice calm and level. "He was a master cartographer. Every map he ever drew was oriented to true north. The man who drew this map was careless. He oriented it to magnetic north, but he did not account for the local declination. In this territory, that is a deviation of 12 degrees. He looked from the flawed map to Judge Clay. "Horst would never have made such an error. This is a forgery." The silence was absolute. Greyhawk's knowledge was so specific, so technical, that it had the immediate ring of truth. Pike stared, his jaw slack, his trump card turned to ash in his hands. He had paid a draftsman in Silver Junction a handsome sum for the forgery, never imagining that anyone in this dusty valley, least of all an Apache, would possess the expertise to expose it. Judge Clay straightened up, his face grim. He took a pen from his coat and made a note on his legal pad. "The court recognizes the map as a likely fabrication," he stated flatly. The matter was closed. Cassia then stepped forward again to deliver the final piece of their evidence. "Your Honor, all the maps and testimony in the world cannot compare to the evidence the land itself provided." She described the flash flood, the destruction of their camp, and the miraculous appearance of the new spring. "The storm did not create this water," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It merely washed away the dirt that was hiding it." "It's true," a voice called out. Leora Penn stepped from the crowd. "I saw it myself. I rode out at dawn. The spring was gushing just as she says." Two other ranchers who had come to offer support nodded in agreement, adding their own testimony. "We saw it." The weight of the evidence was becoming overwhelming. Pike stood defeated, his lies stripped bare. It was then that Ebenezer Roebuck, his face etched with a shame and a resolve that seemed to war with each other, walked to the center of the clearing. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "I have something to say." He did not look at the judge. He looked at Cassia. "I was a fool. I was a scared old man, watching my life's work turn to dust. In my fear, I tried to force my daughter into a bargain. I tried to use this man. He gestured to Greyhawk. As a shield, I was wrong. He finally turned to Judge Clay. This marriage contract was my idea, born of desperation. But what has happened since? The courage she has shown, the truth they have uncovered together, that is all theirs. I release her from any promise made for my sake. Her choice is her own, entirely. It was a full and public confession, an act of profound humility and love. Cassia's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude for her father's redemption. Judge Clay looked from father to daughter, then to Greyhawk. He had heard enough. He stood, and the makeshift court fell silent. The findings of this court are clear, he announced, his voice booming with judicial authority. The primary water source for this region, known as the Rolling Shadow Aquifer, has been proven to exist. The court orders the immediate and complete dismantlement of the temporary dam erected by the Colorado and Salt River line. The natural flow of the Black Willow Wash is to be restored. He fixed his gaze on Pike. A new, comprehensive survey will be conducted. A joint effort between the territorial surveyor and a representative of the Roebuck household, with all findings to be submitted to this court for a final decree on water rights. He then turned to Sheriff Finch. Sheriff, your conduct and your clear allegiance to a commercial interest over the public good have been noted. You will be subject to a full investigation by the territorial marshal. Finch seemed to shrink inside his uniform. Pike was white with rage. He was beaten, but he was not broken. As the judge spoke, Pike turned and gave a sharp nod to a young telegraph boy who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. The boy immediately sprinted toward his horse. The message was clear. Pike was not appealing to the law anymore. He was calling in the full power of the company from the regional headquarters in Silver Junction. He was escalating the war. As the crowd began to break apart, their voices buzzing with the verdict. Cassia stood before them. She needed to say one last thing, to set the final record straight. "I want you all to know," she said, her voice carrying over the murmur. "Ebenezer Roebuck spoke the truth. This all began with a desperate bargain, but it is not how it ends." She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, her friends. "I did not trade my freedom for water." Her gaze then found Greyhawk, who stood watching her. His dark eyes filled with a quiet pride. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling of absolute certainty. "I chose," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its power. "The man who would stand with me to listen to the singing stone." Greyhawk did not move, did not speak. He didn't need to. In the bright morning sun, with the sound of their newfound water singing its song of life, their eyes met. The look that passed between them was a contract more binding than any document, a promise more sacred than any vow. It was the silent, unassailable truth. The victory at the Singing Stone was a fragile dawn, beautiful but fleeting. Before the last of the celebratory wagon riders had even returned to Parish Bend, a new and more insidious threat was already hurtling toward them down a track of iron. Leora Penn's intelligence network was a quiet, efficient thing, built on indebted freight haulers and saloon gossip. The message arrived with a lone rider who had pushed his horse to its limit. Gideon Pike was not retreating. He was doubling down. The telegraph wires had been humming. A special, unscheduled train had been dispatched from the Silver Junction depot. It consisted of a single locomotive and one heavily reinforced boxcar. Its cargo was a massive quantity of dynamite. Its destination was the crippled, temporary dam at Whispering Draw. Pike's plan was diabolical in its simplicity. He intended to obliterate his own dam with a colossal explosion. The official story would be that the freak storm had caused catastrophic structural failure, a tragic but unavoidable act of God. The explosion would send a second, far more destructive flood down the valley, and the blame, he would ensure, would fall squarely on the meddling of the Roebucks and the unpredictable savagery of their Apache ally. He would not only erase the evidence of his illegal dam, but would also turn the entire terrified valley against them. They gathered in Leora's back room, the news hanging like a shroud. Amos Bell paced, running his hands through his hair. "We can't stop a train. We have no legal standing, no authority." "We don't need authority," Cassia said, her voice cutting through the panic. Her mind, honed by the past weeks of strategic thinking, saw not the threat, but the machine that carried it. "We need to outthink it." She looked at Greyhawk. "The railroad has its own rules, its own language. We need to speak it." She spread a crude map of the rail line on the table. "Here," she said, her finger jabbing a spot a few miles from the dam. "Red Lantern switch. It's a manual junction. The main line goes straight, but the switch diverts to a dead-end spur, built to hold maintenance cars. It ends at a sheer rock wall." The plan bloomed in the tense silence of the room. It was audacious, a race against an iron beast. They would not stop the train. They would redirect it. They would send the boxcar of dynamite to its harmless doom. The execution required a split second, three-pronged attack. Greyhawk would take the fastest route, a brutal, direct path through the jagged teeth of Cinder Basin, a place even experienced riders avoided. His task was the most perilous: to get ahead of the train and slow it down, to buy them the precious seconds they would need at the switch. Cassia and Amos, carrying the crucial red and green signal flags, would take the wagon road, a longer but less treacherous route, their race measured in the desperate pounding of their horses' hooves. The final piece of their plan was the most unlikely. They needed to ensure no one from Pike's camp could ride to the switch and stop them. For that, they needed Sheriff Finch. They found him in his office, a man visibly wrestling with the ghosts of his own choices. The threat of the territorial marshal had broken him. "Pike is trying to blow the dam, Sheriff," Cassia said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He's going to flood the whole valley and blame us. We are going to stop him. All we need from you is to block the access road to Red Lantern Switch for 1 hour. Do that, and you might have a story of redemption to tell the marshal. Fail, and you'll be charged as Pike's accomplice." Finch looked at their determined faces. He saw his career in ashes, his future a prison cell. With a trembling hand, he picked up his shotgun. "Get out of here," he muttered, not looking at them. "I've got a road to inspect." It was a reluctant, self-serving act of courage, but it was enough. What followed was a desperate, silent montage of motion. Greyhawk, on his powerful Appaloosa, became a living arrow fired into the heart of the Badlands. Horse and rider moved as one, a fluid dance of muscle and instinct, leaping over ravines and navigating scree-covered slopes at a speed that courted disaster. The wind tore at him, and the sharp rocks threatened to cripple his mount at every step. But he pushed on, his mind fixed on the sound of a distant train whistle. Miles away, Cassia and Amos bounced violently in their light buggy. Amos drove, his knuckles white on the reins, while Cassia clutched the 2 rolled flags to her chest as if they were sacred relics. Every rock and rut in the road was a jolt that threatened to snap an axle, to end their race in a cloud of dust and failure. And at the turnoff to the rail line, Sheriff Finch sat on his horse, his shotgun resting across his saddle. He looked small and lonely, a man caught between 2 worlds. When 2 of Pike's riders galloped toward him, he raised his weapon. "Road's closed," he said, his voice a dry croak. "Surveyor's business." The men cursed and wheeled their horses around, cowed by the symbol of the law he still, however tenuously, represented. The train was a snorting beast of iron and steam, devouring the track at an alarming speed. Greyhawk intercepted it just as it began to cross a long, wooden trestle bridge that spanned a deep gorge. This was his only chance. He urged his horse into a desperate gallop, riding parallel to the thundering machine. The locomotive chugged past him, the engineer oblivious, his eyes fixed on the track ahead. Then came the boxcar, its reinforced steel doors mocking him. He had to uncouple it from the engine. With a prayer on his lips, he spurred the Appaloosa in a final, heart-stopping burst of speed. As he drew level with the coupling between the engine's tender and the boxcar, he launched himself from the saddle. He landed hard on the narrow steel platform, his hands grabbing the iron railings to keep from being thrown into the gorge below. The bridge shuddered under the train's weight. He scrambled toward the boxcar. He could feel the unstable weight of the dynamite inside, the car lurching and swaying violently with every vibration of the tracks. His target was the handbrake wheel on the car's front platform. He threw his entire body into it, trying to turn the rusted, stubborn mechanism. Splinters from the wooden platform drove into his palms. The wheel refused to budge. He strained again, a guttural cry torn from his throat, his muscles screaming in protest. Skin tore on his hands, and blood mixed with the rust and grime on the wheel. With a great groaning shriek, the brake began to engage, the iron shoes sparking against the wheels. The boxcar shuddered, its momentum slowing just slightly. Now for the coupling pin. It was a heavy, vertical iron bar that locked the two cars together. It was stiff with disuse and rust. He kicked at it, hammered it with the heel of his bloodied hand, his movements frantic. The end of the bridge was rushing toward him. He had seconds. With one last, desperate heave, he lifted the pin. The locomotive, freed of its deadly burden, surged forward. Greyhawk, his body screaming with exhaustion, clung to the now slowing boxcar as it rolled, alone, onto the far side of the bridge. At Red Lantern's switch, Cassia could feel the vibration in the ground. The train was coming. The signal pole stood before her, the green flag hanging limply, signaling a clear main track. She fumbled with the ropes, her fingers numb with adrenaline. Amos stood guard, his eyes wide, watching the plume of smoke grow larger. "Now, Cassia, now!" he yelled. The roar was deafening as the locomotive appeared around the bend. She yanked the green flag down. She fumbled with the hook for the red flag, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. One heartbeat before the engine reached the switch. She hauled the rope, and the red flag, the signal to divert, shot to the top of the pole. The locomotive's engineer saw the last-second change. He laid on his horn, a long, panicked shriek of warning, but it was too late to stop. He could only watch in his mirror as the points on the track shifted and the solitary, silent boxcar behind him veered away from the main line, onto the dead-end spur. Cassia and Amos threw themselves to the ground. The boxcar rolled for 100 yards, then smashed into the solid rock wall at the end of the spur. For a second, there was only silence. Then, a silent, blinding flash of white light bleached all the color from the landscape. It was followed a moment later by a deep, gut-punching whump that seemed to press the air from their lungs. The ground heaved. A pillar of smoke, rock, and dust erupted into the sky, and the roar of the explosion echoed off the surrounding mesas. There was no flood. There were no casualties. There was only a smoking crater where the rock wall used to be. They had done it. As the dust began to settle, a new sound emerged, the frantic galloping of a single horse. Gideon Pike appeared, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene, the diverted locomotive, the smoking crater, and the two figures rising from the dust. He drew his pistol. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You've ruined everything." Before he could level the weapon, another rider interposed himself. It was Sheriff Finch. For the first time, he sat his horse with an unwavering authority. He held his shotgun loosely, but his aim was steady. "Put down the gun, Gideon," Finch said, his voice flat and tired. "It's over." Pike laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "It's not over. It's your word against mine. Orlo. And my company owns the word of every man in this territory." "Not this word," a new voice called out. Leora Penn rode up, followed by Amos's messenger, and behind them, a growing crowd of ranchers and townsfolk who had followed from a safe distance. The messenger was carrying a heavy, awkward object, the telegraph machine from the Parish Bend station. He set it down, and Leora pointed to the spool of paper tape. "Your message to the Silver Junction Depot. Mr. Pike," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "The order for the dynamite, the instructions to the engineer, all sent with the official company seal. It seems you signed your own confession." Pike stared at the telegraph, then at the silent, accusing faces of the crowd. It was an orderly gathering, not a mob. They were there as witnesses, their presence a force more powerful than any weapon. The game was up. He slumped in his saddle, a man utterly and completely defeated. Just then, Greyhawk stumbled into the clearing, his face pale with exhaustion, his hands wrapped in makeshift bandages torn from his shirt. The immense physical effort had taken its toll. He took a few unsteady steps. Then his knees buckled. Cassia was at his side in an instant, helping him to a nearby boulder. She supported him as he sat, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Without a word, she reached up and, with gentle fingers, untied the blue bloom scarf from the handle of his knife. The yellow marigold, a small speck of sunshine, fell to the dust. She used her canteen to carefully, tenderly, wash the blood and grime from his torn and bleeding hands. Then, with a reverence that was almost prayerful, she tore the scarf into strips and expertly bandaged his wounds. He watched her, his dark eyes filled with a weary, profound gratitude. The scarf was no longer a symbol of a contract. It was a testament to shared sacrifice, a token that now, and forever, belonged to them both. As she finished, the last of the dark, roiling smoke from the explosion cleared from the sky. The sun, bright and warm, broke through. Its light fell upon the valley, catching the glint of the new, life-giving water as it flowed, clear and steady, down its rightful path, sparkling like a seam of scattered diamonds. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive, with Pike's conspiracy laid bare by the telegraph tape and Doolin's confession. Judge Clay's verdict was delivered not with anger, but with the cold, heavy weight of the law. Gideon Pike was taken into federal custody, charged with conspiracy, attempted destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Sheriff Finch was suspended from his duties, his badge confiscated pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal. A quiet, public humiliation that was a far deeper punishment than any jail cell. The final and most crucial part of the verdict addressed the reason for the entire conflict. Judge Clay, standing before the assembled community, made his decree. The water rights to the Rolling Shadow Aquifer are hereby granted to the established legal entity of the Roebuck Greyhawk household. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. This grant will be for a probationary period of 5 years, the judge continued, raising a hand for silence. During this time, the household will act as stewards, responsible for managing the water source and documenting its capacity. At the end of 5 years, the court will reconvene to review the data and establish a permanent, equitable plan for water distribution throughout the Sable Mesa region, based on the household's findings and the community's needs. It was a wise and forward-thinking solution. It gave them their victory, but it also gave them a profound responsibility. They were not owners, they were guardians. As the crowd began to disperse, relief washing over the valley like a clean, cool rain, Ebenezer Roebuck approached Greyhawk. The old man's face was a roadmap of contrition and a newfound peace. He looked at Greyhawk, not as a tool or a savior, but as a man. He placed a frail, trembling hand on Greyhawk's shoulder. "I was wrong," Ebenezer said, his voice thick with emotion. "I tried to put a chain on my daughter's heart and call it a contract. I see that now." He looked past Greyhawk to where Cassia was speaking with Leora, her face animated and strong. A look of immense pride filled his eyes. He turned back to Greyhawk. "If my daughter chooses you, it is her choice, not mine, not the law's. Hers alone. I want you to know that." Greyhawk simply nodded, accepting the old man's apology and the freedom it offered. Later, when the last of the wagons had rumbled away and an evening quiet had begun to settle over the land. He and Cassia stood alone by the mouth of the Singing Stone Cave. The new spring chuckled and sang beside them. Without a word, Greyhawk drew his knife. The blue fabric of the scarf, torn and stained but still holding its color, was wrapped tightly around the handle. With his bandaged hands, he carefully, deliberately, began to untie the knots. He worked the cloth free and held it out to her in his open palm. The gesture was freighted with meaning. It was the formal dissolution of their pact, the end of the legal fiction that had brought them together. "I do not hold anyone with a piece of cloth," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble. "I hold them with my word. You are free, Cassia. Your part of the bargain is done." Cassia looked at the scarf in his hand, then up into his dark, steady eyes. She felt a sudden, terrifying lurch in her stomach, the feeling of standing on a precipice. Not of danger, but of a profound and life-altering choice. She had her land, her water, her father's blessing. She was free to walk away, to reclaim the life she had once known. But the thought of that life, a life without him, felt like a drought of the soul, a barren landscape she had no desire to return to. "My part of the bargain is done," she agreed softly. She did not take the scarf. Instead, she took a small step closer to him. "But my choice is just beginning." Her voice gained strength, a deep and resonant certainty that came from the very core of her being. "I choose to be with you, not for the court, not for the water." She looked toward the small campfire they had shared the night of the storm, the memory of it vivid and warm. "I choose you because of the way you said my name by the fire. I choose you because you showed me how to listen to the stone. I choose you." A slow warmth spread across Greyhawk's face, a look of profound, quiet joy that he did not try to hide. The warrior's mask was gone, replaced by the open, vulnerable face of a man who was seeing his own heart's desire reflected in the eyes of the woman before him. They walked together along the newly revived banks of the Black Willow Wash. The water, though still muddy from the flood, flowed with a steady, determined pulse. It was a sight so beautiful it made Cassia's chest ache. She thought of the other ranchers, the ones who had offered silent support with cans of water, the ones who had formed a wall of bodies to protect them at the market. "The water is a gift," she said, thinking aloud. "It shouldn't just be ours." She stopped and looked at him, an idea taking shape. "We should dig a new ditch, a small one, from the main channel of the spring, one that runs west, toward the Miller and Pennock farms. They stood with us, in their own way. We should share what we've been given." Greyhawk looked at her, his admiration clear. "It is a good plan," he said. "To share a gift is to make it larger." "We'll call it the Blue Bloom Ditch," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. And so, a new plan was born, not of desperation, but of generosity. They spent the next hour walking the land, envisioning a future built on cooperation. They decided they would hold a weekly water council at Leora's saloon, a place where all the ranchers could come and speak. Amos, with his meticulous nature, would be the perfect secretary, keeping public records of the water levels and allocating shares fairly. Their victory was transforming into a new form of community, a shared stewardship built on the foundation of their fight. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and magenta, they found themselves in the old barn. The scent of hay and cedar filled the air. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow, creating a small circle of light in the growing twilight. The great barn doors were open, framing a perfect view of the spectacular sunset. He turned to her, his bandaged hands coming up to gently cup her face. She leaned into his touch, her own hands resting on his chest. All the chaos, all the fear and struggle of the past weeks seemed to melt away, leaving only the profound, undeniable truth of their connection. They kissed, a deep, lingering kiss that was full of the unspoken words and emotions that had been building between them for so long. It was a kiss of homecoming, a kiss of promise. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her as if he would never let her go. She rested her head on his shoulder, her body molding against his. They stood in silence for a long time, simply holding each other, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear. "I will not fail you, Cassia," he whispered into her hair. A simple, unadorned vow. "You never have," she whispered back, in the quiet intimacy of the barn. With the world outside finally at peace, their fingers found each other and intertwined, a silent, binding promise that needed no judge or contract. The lantern flickered, a small, steady flame against the encroaching darkness. Later, as they sat on a clean blanket, sharing a simple meal of bread and dried jerky, he began to speak. He told her things he had never told another soul. He told her about his childhood in a place called Dry Laurel Valley, a hidden, sacred place that had been taken from his people long ago. He spoke of his mother, a woman with a quiet spirit and hands that knew how to heal. "She was the one who taught me to listen," he said, his voice soft with memory. "She would take me to the rocks when I was a boy. She would say, 'The earth has a heart, and the water is its blood. If you are still enough, you can hear it beat.'" He described how his mother would have him lie on the warm granite for hours, teaching him to feel the subtle vibrations, to distinguish the pulse of the deep water from the tremble of the wind. She said it was the song of our ancestors, a song of survival that could never be silenced. Cassia listened, her heart swelling with every word. He was giving her the most precious gift he possessed, his past. He was showing her the source of his strength, the roots of his wisdom. It was not some abstract, mystical power. It was a legacy of love, a gift from a mother to her son. She listened as if she were hearing a sacred hymn, the story of his soul laid bare in the warm lantern light. When he had finished, a comfortable, profound silence settled between them. The stars had emerged, a brilliant, glittering canopy framed by the open barn doors. Cassia reached for the folded blue scarf that lay beside them. She unfolded it, the fabric soft and worn beneath her fingers. She moved closer to him, and he turned to face her. She rose to her knees and, with gentle, deliberate movements, she lifted the scarf. He tilted his head slightly, a silent question in his eyes. She looped the soft cloth around his neck, the ends draping over his strong chest. It was no longer a symbol of a contract or a bandage for a wound. It was a gift, freely and completely given. She looked into his eyes, her own shining with an emotion so deep it felt like it could fill the entire desert. "Now you keep it," she whispered, her fingers lightly touching the cloth at his throat. "As you would keep my breath in the desert. 3 months can be a lifetime in the desert, under the relentless gaze of a hostile sun. It is long enough for hope to wither and die, but under a sky of grace, it is enough time for a world to be reborn." The sable mesa of autumn was a different land from the one that had suffered through the long, thirsty summer. The rolling shadow spring, now tamed and honored with a carefully constructed stone weir, was the valley's new, beating heart. Its clear, cold water flowed with a steady, generous pulse. From it, 2 new lifelines had been drawn across the landscape. One followed the old path of the Black Willow Wash, reviving the cottonwoods along its banks. The other was a new, gracefully curving channel, dug by the hands of a grateful community, that carried a share of the water westward. They called it the Blue Bloom Ditch, and in the great field behind the Roebuck farmhouse, the barley had risen again, its pale gold heads heavy with the promise of a harvest, a testament to the life that had been reclaimed from the dust. They chose to hold their ceremony not in a church or a courthouse, but on the banks of the new spring, the place of their victory and their beginning. It was not a wedding in the traditional sense, for their bond had already been forged in fire and flood, and they needed no license to validate it. It was a declaration, a public affirmation of a private truth, witnessed by the community they had fought to save. Judge Temper Clay was there, not in his official capacity, but as a friend. He stood before them, a small, worn book of philosophy in his hand, his presence lending a quiet dignity to the proceedings. He read a single line, his voice clear and resonant over the happy music of the running water. "Freedom," he declared, his eyes meeting first Cassia's and then Greyhawk's, "is the condition of honor. May you always honor the freedom in each other." Their guests were a tapestry of their journey. Leora Penn stood with her arms crossed, a rare, proud smile on her face. Amos Bell, looking more like a seasoned frontiersman than a city lawyer, held a small bouquet of wildflowers. The two old ranchers who had testified, the Miller and Pennock patriarchs, stood with their families, their faces, once etched with worry, now relaxed and full of gratitude. And darting among the guests were the two young newsboys from the printer's shop, healthy and full of life, their pockets now filled with wildflowers instead of dire headlines. They ran along the path leading to the spring, scattering petals of desert marigold and purple verbena, their innocent laughter a more beautiful hymn than any church organ could produce. Everyone was safe, and everyone was joyful. Ebenezer Roebuck, his back straighter than it had been in years, stepped forward. In his hands, he held not a weapon or a contract, but a beautiful, old spade with a silver-plated blade, a family heirloom that had been used to break the ground on the farm 2 generations ago. He presented it to Cassia and Greyhawk, holding it so they could both grasp the worn wooden handle. "My hands are too old and too stained with fear to build the future," he said, his voice thick with a hard-won humility. "Yours are not. Take this, not as a symbol of ownership, but as a tool. Build something born of sharing, not of taking. Build a life together that gives back to this land more than it ever takes." It was his final, most profound apology, and his most heartfelt blessing. Then, it was Greyhawk's turn. He walked to a sturdy wooden post that had been set firmly in the ground beside the spring's main pool. Into the wood, he had carefully carved the reclining crescent moon, the ancient symbol of the deep water. He drew his hunting knife. The blade, newly sharpened, gleamed in the afternoon sun. He did not hold it as a weapon. He held it as an offering. With a length of sturdy rawhide, he bound the knife securely to the post, the hilt facing outward, a silent guardian. It was a warrior's pledge. His strength, his skills, his very identity as a protector were now permanently dedicated to this place, this water, this home. Finally, Cassia spoke. She turned to face Greyhawk, taking his bandaged hands in hers. She looked into his eyes, and the entire valley, the entire world, seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them. "When this began," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "I spoke of a contract for water, a marriage of necessity." A gentle smile touched her lips. "Today, I speak only of us. I used to say, a marriage for water. Today, I say, we are for each other." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a long, deep kiss, filled with the warmth of the sun and the promise of all the seasons to come. It was a seal on their past and a vow for their future. As they stood locked in that embrace, under the shade of a newly green-black willow, the community smiled, their hearts full. The camera of memory pulled back, taking in the couple, their friends, and the life-giving water, its surface glittering in the sun, singing its endless, joyful song against the stones. The epilogue of their conflict was written in the days that followed. A federal wagon, dust-covered and official, came for Gideon Pike, taking him away to face a justice far from the land he had tried to break. Orlo Finch, a changed man, formally resigned his position as sheriff. In a surprising turn, he petitioned the new Sable Mesa Water Cooperative, which Cassia and Greyhawk had formed with the other ranchers. He asked to be hired as the valley's first water patrolman, a simple rider tasked with monitoring the ditches and ensuring the fair distribution of their shared resource. His request was granted. It was his penance, and his path back to an honor he had almost lost for good. The first rule written into the cooperative's charter, penned in Amos Bell's neat, clear hand and posted in Leora's saloon for all to see, was simple. Rule 1: no one shall be compelled to enter a union for the sake of water. The final scene of their story unfolded against a sky bruised with the purples and soft roses of a perfect desert sunset. Cassia and Greyhawk rode together on a single horse, climbing the familiar trail to the top of Stagbone Ridge. From that high vantage point, they could see the entire valley laid out before them, a patchwork of recovering fields and hardy pastures. They looked down upon their work. The Blue Bloom ditch was a silver-blue ribbon unfurled across the landscape, a lifeline carrying their promise of community to their neighbors. It was a scar of healing, a beautiful, man-made river that spoke of generosity, not greed. The future was an uncharted territory, as wide and open as the land before them, a future where freedom and love were not bartered, but were intertwined, as essential and enduring as the water and the stone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm always curious to know where the story is being heard, so please drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Cassia and Greyhawk's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, hitting that hype button lets the platform know you found this valuable and helps share our story with more listeners.